So a couple of things just by way of introduction and as sort of disclaimers. First, I have to tell you, I've been doing this for a very, very long time, about 33 years and about 28 of those on the road speaking to audiences much like yourself. And it is rare when you've done something for 28 years to 33 years that you ever really have a unique experience. Everything is sort of the same. You go places, they sort of look the same. You drive through areas, they sort of look the same. I want to tell you, this has been really different. And I mean that in a really positive way, not like, wow, this is different. I can't wait to get the hell home. No, this is fabulous. And you know, when you're 55 almost, new experiences are nice to have. And this has been one. It is a lovely area, this beautiful campus. Driving up here from Sacramento, the first half of the drive, I'm like, yeah, I know this. This looks like every other drive that I do. But then it started getting hilly, and I thought, my God, look at these trees, and then there's a lake, and then I'm about to run off a mountain for a minute. And I thought, well, you know, I don't want to die, but you know, if I died, there are worse places. So I appreciate the opportunity to have a different experience, and then, you know, next week I'll go back to the same old stuff that I always do in the same old places, and it'll be boring, but I will have this memory. The second thing, this is, you know, we're now 3 years into the pandemic, or now I guess it's an endemic thing, but we're still only maybe a year or so really getting back, at least in my case, and people who do what I do, getting back to doing live events like this. A lot of times, for the first couple of years, first 18 months to 2 years, mostly Zoom calls and virtual stuff. And so the reason I mention that is that you get in a habit when you're doing a lot of virtual things. I'm sure you remember this, even if you're not doing those things so much now. And as a result of getting in that habit, I just have to tell you, I'm going to try very hard to keep my head on a swivel. They tell you to do that when you speak. You want to look over here, and you want to look over here. You want to make everybody feel included, as if you're welcoming them into the talk. But I have to tell you, after a couple of years of virtual events, there is a better than average likelihood that I'm going to spend most of my time looking right there, because you, sir, are the green light at the top of my Mac. And I'm fixated on it. I'm not trying to be freaky. I'm not trying to visually stalk you in any way. It's just I'm used to looking there. So I'm going to try to keep moving. If I don't, please forgive me. It's the hypnosis of Zoom calls. Now that I have you in a good mood. See, I do that on purpose. I mean, number one, they always tell you sort of put your audience at ease. I've been doing this long enough to know I need to do that, especially when we're talking about topics that, let's be honest, are not, though they shouldn't be this difficult, they shouldn't be nearly this complicated. They have been made complicated in this country and in this culture by some who I think have ill intention at complicating what should be easy. And so as a result, we end up having to make people feel good before we talk about real stuff, right? Make people feel comfortable before we talk about real stuff. Nothing wrong with that. It's a pedagogical trick. Anyone here who's a teacher knows that you do what you can to get the people you are trying to convey information to be able to take it in. I'm fine with that. I'll play that game. But we should reflect for a minute on why it is so difficult to talk about issues of equity and inclusion, or this word diversity. The fact that that word has become controversial. That was the word we used to mock, y'all, those of us who do this work, because it was so weak, right? It was like that really weak tea that you make and you can hardly taste anything. It's just water, right? Diversity was like the most obvious, basic, fundamental starting point that we didn't even spend a lot of time on it. Equity, yes. Inclusion, yes. Justice and fairness, yes. But diversity was like, really? Come on, do we have to endorse that? Right? Without diversity, the human species wouldn't have even made it this far. So endorsing diversity is like, I like oxygen. That's like saying, I like oxygen, right? I like the fact that I can walk upright and speak. Like, these are basic things that humans have evolved to more or less do, and diversity is central to that. This country has always been a diverse country, hasn't been an equitable country. That's the bigger issue. But now, even the word diversity is apparently controversial. So we're having to redo a lot of stuff that we were doing a long time ago. I remember having this conversation about diversity 28 years ago at Modesto Junior College, where I have been. See, they brought me, y'all didn't. They brought me. 28 years ago. And I remember mocking the notion of diversity as like the bare minimum. And now we got to go back to that. So whatever. We got to do what we got to do. We'll cover old ground, but then we will make up for the difference and try to link that notion of diversity to greater equity and justice and fairness. But in order to do that, because of the current climate, right? I have to spend a few minutes just making sure everybody knows what this conversation is not about, right? I shouldn't have to do that. Like, that's not really the template for speeches like this. Like, let me tell you what it's not about, and then I'll get to what it is. But I have to, because there are some preconceived notions that people have when we talk about equity and inclusion and diversity as issues, particularly on a college campus, or really any institutional space. The first thing that this is not about, not only in this room, but in general, when those of us who do this work, it is not about guilt, it is not about shame, it is not about making people feel bad because of their racial identity, gender identity, religion, sexuality, class, or any other identity. It isn't about that. It is about taking responsibility for the world as we find it. There is a difference between guilt and responsibility. Guilt is what you feel for the stuff you actually did to people. Responsibility is something that you take because of the kind of person that you are. Right? We take responsibility for stuff all the time that we didn't cause. I know that none of you are the cause of institutional and systemic racial inequality throughout the course of American history. I'm relatively clear on how old you are. None of y'all 200-something years old. None of y'all created it. I didn't create it. Like I said, I'm not quite 55, so I can only own the part that I can own. But the point is, I, like you, we were born into a society of profound inequality. Right? We were born into a society where the horses were already out of the barn, so to speak, right? So now it's a question of trying to figure out how to get them back in, not arguing about who let them out. That's not really the point. The point is we inherit the legacy. It's like of our families, we inherit those legacies, right? I don't know about y'all, I'm in therapy. My therapist says I should tell you that because apparently it's incredibly therapeutic to confess. And if y'all aren't in therapy, you need to get in it because y'all all messed up just like me. I'm not the only one. The difference is some of us, I don't know why people clap for therapy. That is like such a 2023 thing. It's like, oh, he's doing his work. Well, maybe. Maybe I am. If I'd really done it, I wouldn't need to keep going. So I clearly haven't done it right. But when you're in therapy, why do you go to therapy? You go to therapy, you get clear on the damage that you've inherited. Right? Not so that you can feel crappy about it. I don't go to therapy so my therapist can look at me and go, well, you are really screwed up and you should feel like shit about that. Like, I go to therapy so that I can figure out why I do the messed up stuff that I do, right? That is to say, I'm not to blame for the legacy that I inherited, but I got to take responsibility for how I relate to that legacy so that I don't keep bringing it out in the world. Right? And just like that's true with our individual families, it's true with society. We inherit the legacy of a broken society. Now the question is, what are we going to do about it? Talking about racism and sexism and heterosexism and the class system and all of these things is not about shaming people who are on the top of the power structures with those relative identities. Right? But it is about saying that whether you're on the top of that structure, somewhere in the middle of that structure, or on the bottom of that structure, we all have a couple nickels in the quarter, and we have to take responsibility for figuring out how to create the country that we were told we lived in, and have actually never lived in for even 1 minute of one day. Right? That's our job as quote-unquote Americans, right? And so this isn't about guilt, it's not about making people feel bad, it is about getting to the place that we need to be. The second thing it's not about is calling out any given individual as being biased or prejudiced or racist. It's not about accusing people of personal bias. I'm bored by that conversation, right? The idea that, oh, you're just trying to say I'm racist. I don't know. I'm not your therapist, so I don't know if you are or not, except insofar as we all have inherited some of that. We've been raised in a society of profound racial bias, inequality, stereotypes, same thing with gender and sexuality, same thing with class, same thing with religion, same thing with disability. We've all imbibed that. So the idea that any of us are completely free from it is absurd. Of course not. Advertising works, right? That's why companies spend billions of dollars to sell you toilet paper and tennis shoes and tablets and toothpaste and other things that apparently all start with T, because that's the only stuff I can come up with on the spur of the moment, right? They spend billions of dollars on those Super Bowl ads to sell you products. And we know from the research that if you see an ad for a product like 12 times, that's the point at which you become exponentially more likely to purchase it. So if that's true for selling you toilet paper, how much easier is it to sell you on racial stereotypes when you've been seeing that ad, so to speak, all of your life? Same thing with gender, sexuality, class, disability. So of course we've internalized it. Of course we have bias. But again, to spend a lot of time talking about that is boring. It's like saying, well, we're air breathers. Yes, now what? sort of dwell on individual level bias, whether it's conscious or subconscious. I mean, I guess it's interesting if you're a psychologist, but it doesn't really solve the problem, right? This isn't about individual blame and shame. It isn't about individual bias. Racism and all these other isms are systems. We know that because they end with the letters ISM. And this isn't even politics now. See, now this isn't politics. This isn't ideology. This is like basic grammar, y'all. Right? When words end with those three letters, we know something about them. Right? Racism and sexism and classism and all these other isms, they end with those three letters, and therefore they are like other isms. Authoritarianism, fascism, socialism, communism, capitalism, what are those things? Yeah, they're ideologies, but they're also systems, right? They're ways of actually organizing a society, not just ways of thinking about it. And so racism isn't just about what's up here in your head. Sexism isn't just about what's up here in your head. Classism isn't just about what's up here in your head and how you view poor and working class people of all colors, right? It's also about the way the society is constructed to treat people differently on the basis of those various identities, right? And systems are perpetuated by four things: policies, practices, procedures, and paradigms. 4 Ps, right? Policies, practices, procedures, and paradigms. Paradigms meaning just, fancy-ass word for ways of looking at the world or constructing it. Worldviews, cosmologies, that's an even bigger word that I never use, but I just thought of it. I thought it sounded smart. So. Right? Policies, practices, procedures, and paradigms keep systems in place, and those systems can perpetuate unfairness even in the absence of intent. Which is, again, why I don't really want to talk about personal bias, because the problem is you can be a perfectly lovely person. You can be a perfectly well-intended person. You can be a completely, at least in theory, unbiased person. I say in theory because in practice that's not actually real. But in theory, were it possible, it would not matter, right? Because good people can get caught up in bad systems. Good people with the best of intentions can find themselves in flawed systems, and if they don't know how to interrogate those systems, because they haven't been trained on how to do it, really ever taught how to do it, if they haven't given significant thought to how those systems could be going awry, then all the best intentions in the world won't matter. And in fact, sometimes the good intentions make it harder to fix the systems because everybody's so wrapped up in thinking how good they are. Right? I'm a good person doing good things. Right? For anyone who's an educator, that's a thing, right? Because educators are in what they call a helping profession, just like nurses and therapists and social workers. And you didn't go into education to become rich. We're clear on that. You didn't do it for the money. You didn't do it for the respect, even though educators and people who work in educational institutions deserve respect. We know you don't always get it. So you didn't do it for either one of those things. You did it because you wanted to make a difference in the lives of students. You wanted to make a difference in the life of your community. So your intentions are almost always good when you go into that kind of institutional setting. And yet, if the policies, practices, procedures, and paradigms under which you operate are in some way flawed or inadequate to the task of creating equity and inclusion, then no matter what you come in intending to do, you may not be able to produce that on the way out the door, right? So it's not about personal bias. What is it about? This conversation is first and foremost about learning to see and understand what you have never been required to see and understand. Right? One of the things that we talk about a lot that creates maybe the most pushback in this work, we use terms like privilege and people get very defensive, whether we're talking about white privilege, male privilege, straight privilege, Christian privilege, the privilege of affluence, whatever it is, able-bodied privilege. We talk about privilege, people get defensive because they hear the word and they assume we're talking about money, and then we all of a sudden, we're all the hard-working children of West Virginia coal miners as soon as that conversation starts. We're just all coal miners' daughters and sons coming from the hills and hollers of northern Kentucky. Some of my people are, I don't know about y'all, but all of a sudden, or we revert to the story of our immigrant ancestors, those of us who are white in particular, we do this, right? We say things like, well, my great-great-great-grandfather came here with 18 cents and a ball of lint in his pocket. I know, I've heard the story. It's my family's story as well, right? So we like to deflect when the issue of privilege comes up because we think we're talking about wealth, and wealth is one kind of privilege. It's economic privilege. Some people have it, some people don't. It certainly overlaps with race, but it doesn't always track perfectly with race. But that's not the kind of privilege that I'm interested in talking about. The one privilege that I want to talk about today is the only one that I have any real concern about today, and it's the privilege of obliviousness, right? The privilege of being oblivious to other people's experiences and realities that aren't the same as your own. And you know what? Every single one of us in this room has that in some category. That's not just a white thing or a white male thing or a straight white male thing or a straight white Christian male thing. Everyone in this room has got some area where you get to be oblivious to other people's reality, because everybody in this room has got at least one category where you're the quote-unquote norm. I guarantee it. I'm not saying that everyone in the world is like that. There are no doubt rooms to which I could speak where there would be somebody in that room whose every identity was marginalized. But on a college campus in the wealthiest nation in the history of the world, y'all ain't the ones, right? Everyone in this room has got some area. May not be racial privilege, but you might have able-bodied privilege. May not be able-bodied privilege, but it might be straight privilege. May not be straight privilege, but it might just be the privilege of being on a college campus in a professional job that gives you a certain amount of power and influence relative to like 99.999% of the world's population. So every one of us has got some area where we don't have to know things. And when you have the privilege of being oblivious to other people's reality, odds are you won't know their reality. And then that's where we get in trouble, right? Anytime you get to be oblivious to anything, you're not likely to know about it. And it's no shame in being oblivious. I'm oblivious to lots of stuff. I am oblivious to calculus. Thank you. I'm glad to know apparently there are a few more graduates of the Metro Nashville public school system here for whom calculus was not required. That is why I'm oblivious to it, by the way. Right? It's not that it's not a valuable endeavor. If one is going to be an engineer, one really doesn't need it for this thing that I do, but I'm oblivious to calculus. Why? Because I never took it. And I didn't take it because they didn't make me. The Nashville public school system said you got to have 3 years of math, and so though I was not good at math, I did understand probability and statistics. I understood that the best thing that I could do would be to take Algebra 1 again in 9th grade. I'd already taken it, but I said, what the hell? I think I can do better. As it turns out, I couldn't, but I took it again, then I took geometry, then I took Algebra 2. Though I didn't even take trig. I was done. And I got my high school diploma, and I got out of there, and I went to college, I took one math class, and then I was done with that. So I'm oblivious to calculus. As a result, if I were to stand up here and try to do it, y'all would all know, except for that guy who apparently doesn't understand it either. The rest of y'all would be, or maybe he's the calculus teacher, and he's like, good, I'm glad. You know, I hate my job. I don't know. I don't know what the story is, but anyone who had taken calculus, you would all immediately know, like, that dude does not know what in the hell he is talking about. Exactly. The problem is the same is true with our larger society. We've got a lot of people who think they understand, for instance, a lot of white folks who think we understand if racism exists better than black and brown folks, and we never took the class. Do you understand the analogy? A lot of men who think that we're a better determiner of whether or not sexism exists or rape culture exists or whatever than women who actually experience it and have to live with that. A lot of folks who are straight and cisgender who act like we understand better whether transphobia is real, whether straight supremacy is real, or whether trans identity is even a thing. We apparently think we're better at determining that than people who live in that body and live in that identity and embody that identity, right? That's arrogance of a profound, it'd be like me standing up here like, I'm gonna teach y'all calculus for real, even though I never took the class. We never took all of those classes. We never experienced all of those lives, and yet sometimes we pontificate as if we know better rather than just listening. That's the privilege of being oblivious, because you can do that and be taken seriously. You can be oblivious to other people's reality and actually still be considered an expert on stuff affecting them, right? Whether it's an educational system, whether it's a healthcare system, whether it's a job market, housing, the justice system, right? And so part of us getting better at this is relinquishing that privilege of obliviousness, because it gets us in trouble. Just to give you a historical reference point for this, and how even really good people can be oblivious to things. You know, it's interesting, if I were to ask most people in 2023, you know, do you think, if I ask most white folks, let's say in particular, do you think racism, systemic racism is still a significant problem? We're gonna have a lot of different opinions. Some people are gonna say absolutely, some people are gonna say absolutely not, a lot of people are gonna be somewhere in between, right? They're going to say, well, it depends, maybe in this area, but not in this area, or yeah, but it's getting a lot better, and blah, blah, blah. We're going to have different opinions, that's fine. I respect that. I think the answer to the question is yes, and if I had a semester's worth of time, I could prove it to you in a syllabus, we'd be done, and I would demonstrate it to you because I'm good at what I do, and I could do that. But, don't have time for that, number one, and it's not really the point, because even though I think the answer to the question, is systemic racism real in 2023, is yes, What I really want to talk about is the fact that 50 or 60 years ago, almost everyone would have said it was yes. Now, in retrospect, not at the time, but looking backward. If I were to ask you, do you think 1963, for instance, 60 years in the rearview mirror, that systemic racism was real? Even the people who deny it now would almost all say yes, right? I mean, that's like a no-brainer. That was before the Civil Rights Act was passed. It was before the Voting Rights Act. It's 5 years before the Fair Housing Act. So if I were to ask you, 60 years ago in 1963, do you think systemic racism was a major national problem and that black folks in particular were treated profoundly unequally in this country? There's very few people going to deny it. Like even the Klan will acknowledge it, right? They will lament the change since 1963, but they're not going to deny the problem was real. They just would say it wasn't a problem, but they're going to accept the reality of the systemic inequality. Here's the problem, though. It's one thing for you 60 years after the fact to admit how profoundly unfair this country was, but what do you think white folks said at the time? In 1963, when 1963 wasn't in the rearview mirror, when it was literally going on all around the folks at that time. Because it should have been an easy question even then, right? If you ask folks in 1963, do you think black people are treated equally in your community in housing and jobs and education? It's not like a tricky pop quiz, y'all. It's an easy question. The answer is no, right? That was the year that George Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door and announced segregation today, tomorrow, and forever. It's the year Medgar Evers got shot down dead in his driveway in Jackson, the head of the Mississippi NAACP. It's the year that the Birmingham Children's Campaign took place and Bull Connor turned water cannons and dogs on children in that city. We understand that that's the year of the March on Washington, y'all. 225,000 people in late August in Washington, D.C. on the mall complaining because something was wrong, right? And yet in 1963, when Gallup organization, the pollsters, asked that question of white Americans, do you think black people are treated equally in your community? 2 out of 3 said yes. No problem. Nothing to see here. Racism? What racism? Discrimination? What discrimination? Unfairness? What in the world are you talking about? Keep in mind how profoundly oblivious that required a person to be, because the evidence was all around. You couldn't avoid it. There were only 3 television stations in 1963, y'all, and they went off at midnight, and they're like the, national anthem and then fuzz for like 6 hours. You had to wake up at 6 o'clock, and there was no streaming, there was no nothing. Everybody's watching the same damn stuff, right? Millions of people watching the same, because it's all you had to watch. So it's not like people didn't see it. But for whatever reason, even good people didn't intuit what that meant. And so when they were asked that question, the majority of white Americans looked around and said, yeah, I don't see a problem. Is that because they're unfeeling, horrible, hateful people? No. It's because they had the privilege of obliviousness. They did not have to know what black folks experienced, because it wasn't going to be on the test, was it? And by that I mean whatever test they had to take to get out of high school, get into college, med school, law school, grad school, business school, get a professional certification in any career or a license to practice any profession. You didn't have to know any better. So even if you're a good person, you got to remain in that veil of ignorance. I don't mean ignorance pejoratively, I just mean it in the pure sense of the word, right? Not knowing. I got to remain in that place because nobody required me to know any differently. And I would suggest that that's not just a 1963 problem. That even today, we can remain ignorant to other people's stuff. And as of this week, of course, and this morning in particular, it was announced that the great state of Arkansas, next door to my state of Tennessee, has announced that they're just going to dispense with AP African American Studies because apparently it makes white people feel bad to learn about the history of the country. Right? It makes white people feel bad to learn the history of Arkansas, right? And the country writ large. So we want to maintain that veil of ignorance. We want to maintain that luxury of obliviousness. Now, keep in mind, students of color in Arkansas are not going to be able to opt out of world history, European history, regular standard dominant culture, American history. They're not going to be able to opt out of that. But apparently, the other students can and will be allowed to opt out, and not only opt out, they will be disallowed to opt in to African American AP history or African American studies, right? Because the veil of ignorance and obliviousness is still real. We still get to be ignorant to other people's stuff, and the problem is you cannot build a multiracial democracy with a community of people who you don't understand and have never had to learn to work with, sit next to, talk to, learn from, right? And so the task of building a multiracial democracy, the task of what James Baldwin referred to as achieving our country, right, requires of us a different mentality. It doesn't require, people, when we talk about privilege, people are like, what do you want me to do? Give away my house, quit my job? Nobody is asking you to give away your damn house. Nobody is asking you to quit your job and give it to somebody else. I'm only asking for the relinquishment of the privilege of your own obliviousness, to learn to listen as much as we speak, to learn to take in the perspectives of other people in an educational setting in particular, because if we don't do it, we're not going to be able to survive as a society. So that's what this is about. It's also about interrogating the norms that we take for granted, systemic norms that we take for granted. Because what happens is, and it happens in educational settings, it happens in corporate settings, it happens in government agencies, it happens in religious institutions, it happens in labor unions, it happens in nonprofits, right? Is we get used to, we get comfortable with the way we've always done stuff, even as society is changing, both demographically and culturally. We get locked into certain norms and ways of doing things, certain policies, practices, and procedures that have worked pretty well for members of the dominant group socially, but maybe don't work as well for everyone. And the fact that we get locked into them is not because we're necessarily trying to perpetuate injustice. There might be some people who are, but I'm not really focused on it. It's just simply because we get used to doing things a certain way. What are some of the ways we do that? Well, think about how people get jobs in this country. We'd like to believe, when you ask people how they make hiring decisions, it could be at a college, it could be at a company, it could be anywhere. They'll always say, well, we hire the most qualified person, as if you could rank 330 million Americans from 1 to 330 million and then just pick, right? Like, we make it seem so objective and so easy. Well, we just want the most qualified person, but what does that mean in a society where we know a disproportionate number of jobs are obtained through networking, connections, who you know at least as much, if not more, than what you know? We know there was a study a few years ago found that almost half of the new jobs in the American economy after the 2008-2009 recession were being filled that way, specifically through one type of networking, institutions where somebody worked and they knew somebody else who wanted a job at that institution. They wrote a letter of reference or recommendation for them, and it helped grease the skids for that next person to get a job. That could be a staff or administrative job, it could be a faculty entry gig, it could be a corporate gig, it could be a government gig, whatever. In other words, people go into bat for other people. Now, in theory, there's nothing wrong with that, right? In theory, there's nothing particularly racially exclusive or gender exclusive or class exclusive, but what the research finds is that certain people benefit more and others quite a bit less by a system of networking, right, whereby people are obtaining jobs in that way. Who are the people who tend to be left out of the best networks for the best opportunities? They are disproportionately people of color, they are women of all colors, and they are working class people of all races. So you could be a person of color, you could be a woman of any color, you could be a working class white guy. And if you don't know the right people, which statistically you will be less likely to, apparently, according to the research on this, then you're not going to be able to compete for the job, even if you're the most qualified person for it, right? Sometimes we use the analogy in this work of certain groups of people in this country getting 5-lap deficits in an 8-lap race and having to start out 5 laps behind. That's a pretty good analogy. This is actually worse than that, right? This is like not even knowing where the racetrack's at, right? Like not even knowing there's a race today, not even knowing there's a competition that you could enter because nobody told you about the race, because you didn't have the right connections or the right network. So that's a policy, a practice, a procedure, a norm that exists all throughout the American workforce, in public and private sector, in education, in corporate America, and to one degree or another, it skews who ends up being in the pool for opportunity. It works if you're in those networks, it works for you, which means disproportionately it works for people who are in dominant social and cultural groups and more likely to be connected in that way. But for others, it's not working. So if we don't interrogate it, if we don't make sure that we're casting the net as broadly as possible and as widely as possible to find talent, two things are going to happen. Number one, we're going to perpetuate injustice and inequality and a lack of inclusion on the part of race and gender and class and other things. The second thing is we're going to overlook a lot of really great people, right? In fact, we're likely to overlook some of the most qualified people, because let's be honest, like, what are the odds that Jim over in accounting actually knows the next most qualified person for the next opening? Like, I'm not good at math, like I told you, but like, that's simple math. What are the mathematical odds that in a country as vast as ours, in a state as vast as yours, that Jim over in the accounting department happens to play golf with the guy who is the most qualified for the next gig on the staff at the college or whatever? It's pretty unlikely, right? Pretty unlikely. So we end up overlooking people who could have added something not only from a diversity and inclusion perspective, but also from an excellence perspective, which is to say that if we don't interrogate our norms, not only do we perpetuate unfairness, we undermine the credibility and the quality of the institution itself. So the privilege of being oblivious to that isn't really a privilege at all. It's actually a harm. It actually sets us up in many ways. We have to interrogate our norms. The same is true not just with Old Boys Networks, but even with other ways in which we evaluate people for jobs. Because even if we're not hiring people based on networking, even if we're hiring people based on their resume, right? On their vita, on their actual work experience, that's not nearly as objective as we think either, is it? Unless we understand it in social context. That goes back to that 8-lap race and some have a 5-lap head start. If I've had a 5-lap head start on you in a race, I should hit the tape first, right? That's how it works. That's what having a head start means. I should hit the tape before you. The question is, if I start out 5 laps ahead of you and at the end of the race I'm only up by 3 laps, am I really the one you want on your track team? I think not, right? But in this country, we have a winner-take-all kind of thing. So whoever hit the tape first, whoever has the best resume, whoever got the highest test score, whoever, whatever, right? We got all these supposedly objective merit indicators of talent and ability, and we hire based on that. Some schools admit to certain programs on the basis of that, right? But those standards aren't really objective because they are the creation of a system that existed before those individuals entered the race. Some people will have greater opportunity to accumulate those credentials, and other people will have less. So if all we're doing is just looking just in a really colorblind, socially unconscious way at what we're seeing, we're going to miss that certain people have overcome more obstacles to get wherever they are than other folks. The person that shortened the distance in that race from 5 laps to 3 is the one you want on the team. Even though technically they're still behind, right? Technically. But they ran faster. They actually put out more effort. But that's not how we evaluate things a lot of times. I remember years ago I started asking people at colleges and in corporate settings too. I'd look up the latest job postings that they had posted. And I would notice things like 5 to 7 years experience preferred, 4 to 6 years, 2 to 3 years, 10 to 12, whatever, depending on the position, right? And I would ask people in HR, I would ask people in the departments, I'd say, why 5 to 7? Like, why? What's that about? Why 4 to 6? Right? And not once in 28 years of doing this on the road has anybody ever responded to that question by saying, well, smartass, now that you asked, here is our longitudinal study of our employees that demonstrates clearly with quantitative and qualitative metrics that if you don't have exactly this number of years, you will fail at this job. No one has ever done a study to justify any of this stuff. You know what the reason is? The reason is that's what I had to have to get it. Oh, that's what the last person that got hired had to have. So in other words, it's a positional good. This is the hurdle I had to jump, and by God, you're going to have to jump it too. Not because it's necessarily the end-all, be-all of being qualified, but because that's the way we've always done it. Well, who does that tend to exclude? Disproportionately, it's going to exclude people who were later to get into the pipeline through no fault of their own. But it could be because of racial exclusion, it could be because of sex or gender, it could be because of class. Again, this is going to hurt a lot of working class white folks, right? Who live in rural and semi-rural areas, who may not have the same connections, maybe didn't get in the same pipeline, but they're every bit as good. So all of those objective standards, quote unquote, that we a lot of times don't interrogate aren't really that objective. They're highly subjective because they reflect the social dynamics of the community that produce those outcomes. And so we have to be willing to interrogate the norms, the things that we take for granted. The same is true with schooling itself and the paradigm that we bring to teaching and to educating other students in our care. Right? Whether that is at a community college, whether that is at some fancy 4-year elite private institution on the East Coast or Stanford somewhere on the West Coast, right? Doesn't matter. Private, public, 2-year, 4-year, elite, non-elite, doesn't matter. School in this country oftentimes operates under the basis of a paradigm which isn't always working for everyone. What do I mean by that? Well, if you think about why people go to school nowadays, it used to be, you go back 50 years or so, and they would ask that question. AP and others would ask the question, you know, what's the purpose of an education? And there was that brief period of time in the late 60s and early 70s when there were a lot of different answers, and some of them were, you know, developing a workable philosophy of life, et cetera, figuring out, you know, how to be a better citizen of the world, But nowadays, those answers are like pretty much gone. You ask the same question and people say, we go to school to get a job so we can make a living, make a lot of money, move up. In other words, it's a lot about personal advancement, private personal advancement, right? And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. You need to be able to pay your bills, you need to be able to care for your family, I get it. Having a job is a way to do that, and getting an education can help you get a better job, so I understand. But education is not simply professional development, at least not in the eyes of marginalized communities. That is a very dominant cultural paradigm, right? That you go to school for you. Right? But historically, in this country, if you were a member of a marginalized population, would that have made any sense for you to think that was the reason you went to school, so you could move up the ranks of power? It would have been irrational, right? Like under segregation, if black folks had taken the mentality that, well, I'm going to school so I can get a good job and work up and run the company and have a lot of power, that would have been very frustrating, because under segregation, that was almost guaranteed not to happen. So the black community, under conditions of marginalization, had to come up with a different paradigm, right? And this is true of any marginalized population. In any country, not just our own. When you've been economically marginalized, you cannot have the same way of thinking about schooling as the people for whom opportunity has historically been there. Because you'll be frustrated, because the obstacles are too big. But when you're marginalized, you create a mentality that says, no, the purpose of education isn't just for me to get a job and make more money and move up professionally and support my family. It's about uplifting the entire community from which I come. There's a collective and a social purpose to education. So under segregation, black folks created what educational theorist Teresa Perry calls the paradigm of freedom for literacy and literacy for freedom, right? The idea was we have to be free to have a chance to get educated, but we got to be educated to really be free, right? In other words, it was all of us or none of us. We're not going to school so we can get ours and turn our back on everybody that we came from. We're getting our education so we can uplift the whole. That mentality is not the dominant mentality for schooling in this country, and that's not meant as a criticism of, let's say, white folks or middle-class white folks. It's just if I'm middle class or above and I'm white, why would that be my thinking? Why would I think of schooling as collective uplift? We don't need collective uplift. We're sort of uplifted already, right? But if I'm a member of a marginalized group, racially, economically, culturally, linguistically, an new immigrant group or something, right? My mentality has to be more collective. So if what we're doing is we're operating under an educational paradigm of individualism and accomplishment, right? That may be off-putting to indigenous folk, to Latino folk, to black folk, to Asian American and Pacific Islander folk who take a more collective understanding of the purpose of schooling, right? Who see it as something that has to be for the entire community, not just for themselves. And so yes, it might be career preparation, of course, but it also has to be more than that. It pains me to no end when I go into, and this has happened a lot, I go into school districts around the country, talk to K-12 educators, and a lot of times I run into folks, sometimes in colleges too, community colleges in particular, I've had this happen, but it's especially true in high school. I run into teachers and administrators and staff in our K-12 schools that say things to their kids, particularly if they're kids of color or poor kids or working class kids of any color. They'll say things like, you know, the reason you need to stay in school is so you can get out of here and make something of yourself. You know? Get out of your environment. Right? I want you to think about that. See, because teachers say that and they think they're doing these kids a favor, right? Like, you get out of here, you can get out of your environment, you can better yourself. But do you hear what the child hears? Do you hear what we're saying? What we're saying when we say that is everything you come from is broken. And not only broken, but bad. And the best that you can hope for is to get the hell out and never look back. Not to stay in that space and empower that community and uplift that community and change the conditions under which that community lives, but just run as fast as you can. That is a horribly abusive and disempowering message, right? But it makes sense if you're coming from a dominant paradigm that just looks at education as what can I get out of it, as opposed to what do we get out of it. So the purpose of education, especially in a community college system, which is about the community, is responding to the broader needs of that community and all of its constituent parts. Not just those for whom the dominant paradigm has worked, but those for whom perhaps it doesn't work. And so we have to imbue education with a social purpose, a collective meaning, not just about individual accomplishment, but something bigger than that. Why is this important? It's important because, and you heard this, your president talked about this when she was doing her introduction, right? That no matter who grows up in and around this community and perhaps comes to this institution, we know full well, not only here but all around the country in communities just like this one, a lot of young people are going to leave. Right? They're going to leave for other opportunities. They're not going to stay here because they want something different in their lives. They may come back, They may come back, like I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, never thought I would end up back there. I'm back there now after having gone away for 10 years and lived in New Orleans. People come back. Most of us will die within 60 miles of where we were born. That's either incredibly beautiful or incredibly sad, depending on your perspective. Right? But it's true, and yet people will go out though, right? They will go out, and even if they're going to come back, they're going to have different experiences. And when other people come to the community, perhaps new immigrants, migrant labor, people who are coming in for the first time, and other folks are leaving, if the people who are leaving do not understand how to live in the broader world beyond that which they knew growing up, and if the people who are coming in are not met by people who have also been trained to be functional in a different type of cultural context, then the odds of creating an inclusive, and not only inclusive, but a healthy environment for anyone are going to be far longer odds, right? Because what will happen is unless we have these conversations, unless we put diversity and equity and all of these concepts at the front of the conversation, unless we make training around that and orientation around that part of what it means to go to college in the 21st century, what it means to be competent in the 21st century, we won't be able to create the kind of cooperation and collaboration needed to make the society functional for anyone. There won't be a significant amount of trust. I know that one of the programs you have here, you have folks that are preparing for careers in healthcare, and that is obviously, every bit of research suggested, going to be one of the fastest growing areas of professional opportunity in this country over the next 20 to 30 years, in large part because we are an aging population. I am painfully aware of why healthcare is going to become so important. We are a rapidly aging population. I individually know what this feels like. We collectively need to understand what it feels like. But let's be very clear. If you're going to prepare people for careers in healthcare, it could be as nurses, it could be as any type of clinician, whatever it is, if you're going to prepare people for that world and those kinds of jobs, they've got to understand some of the reasons that health inequity is still so persistent in this country. And it isn't just about money. See, we sometimes think that. We think that the disparities between white folks and black folks and indigenous folk and Latinx folks when it comes to healthcare, for instance, are all about who has money and who doesn't. That's part of it. But what we also know is that even when you take black folks, for instance, who went to college, who have good jobs, who have good healthcare, they have worse health outcomes than white folks who didn't even finish high school. Actually, more likely, higher rates of infant mortality for the offspring of black women with college degrees than white women who dropped out after the 10th grade. White women who smoke every day during their pregnancy actually still have better health outcomes for their children than black women that never smoked a single cigarette. White women who didn't go to a single appointment with a doctor while they were pregnant actually have better health care outcomes in terms of infant mortality and birth weight than black women who went to all the well baby clinical meetings with their doctors and nurses, did all the things they were supposed to do. So even black and brown folks who are socioeconomically better off are still having worse outcomes. Well, why? The research says experiences with discrimination that have a cumulative effect on the health of the body, right? And also the lack of trust that often exists between black and brown patients on the one hand and disproportionately white clinicians. So diversity, equity, and inclusion isn't just about getting more black and brown folk into a program. It's about making sure that the white folk in the program, whether they remain the majority or they don't remain the majority, that they know how to talk about this stuff. That they understand the dynamics of inequality so that they can do their job better. Because, and I talked about therapy earlier, if you're going to try to be a therapist to someone who's culturally different than you, right? Or racially different, ethnically different, economically different, religiously different, sexually different, how in the hell are you going to do that if you don't understand not only their perspectives, but the realities they experience, if you don't know the history? If I don't know the history of the way that the healthcare community has and has not responded to the needs of black and brown peoples, why in the world would I think that they're going to trust me when I walk in the room in the lab coat or whatever, right? Or when I sit down to try to be the therapist and ask them, why are you here today? Right? You think somebody's going to trust somebody who they think doesn't understand them? Of course not. So we have to put these issues at the forefront, no matter how uncomfortable it makes. It's not simply for some politically correct motivation. Again, it's not about ideology. We have to do it for the sake of competence so that we can do our jobs better. And ultimately, we have to do it because our fates are linked, whether we realize that or not. And I think we don't. We're a deeply divided country, and we think that sometimes, we think in this zero-sum kind of way, right? Which is if we have greater equity and these other people who have been marginalized get a bigger piece of the pie, then I have to get a smaller piece of the pie because we don't think we can bake more pie. We sort of just figure like there's this one pie and this is it, man. This is how many slices there are. So if these black and brown folk get more, I'm getting less. right? If these gay folk get to marry, man, my straight marriage is devalued. What? Like, it's not going to be as special anymore, right? Like, if they get to marry, then what good is my marriage? If that's your attitude, you might want to rethink the marriage thing. Right? It's not about heterosexual or homosexual. It's about the fact that you're asking deep, deep questions about the validity of your own marriage because someone else got to have one. It's weird. Sort of weird. But that's what we do. We think zero sum. If they get more, we get less. If we become religiously more pluralistic, that's somehow a swipe against my Christian faith. I'm being oppressed. This is what happens because when you have hegemony, pluralism feels like oppression. Right? When you're used to hegemony, that is to say the absolute dominance of a culture, pluralism feels like the wheels are coming off the bus. My God, I have to share the toys in the toy box. What the hell? Never had to do that. Right? And even decent people can get caught up in feeling some kind of way about that, right? Because if I haven't had to share, and all of a sudden I'm having to share, it can be hard. I get it. But it's time for us to grow because our fates are linked. If you don't believe me, think about rural and semi-rural communities like this one, right? That have been racked in the last 15 years by an opioid crisis that no one seems to be able to figure out how to get their hands around. Why did that happen? Why is it that rural and semi-rural small town folk, 50 and older in particular, working class without college degrees, have been so disproportionately ravaged by the opioid crisis? I'll tell you one of the reasons is because 35 and 40 years ago, we as a country decided that drug addiction was a crime problem and not a public health problem, and that the answer was to lock people away. And we did that because we viewed them as black, and we viewed them as brown, and we viewed them as urban, and we didn't care. And so we threw them away, locked them away, and threw away the key, and didn't worry about rehab, didn't worry about treatment, didn't worry about drug education, didn't worry about diversion programs. And now 40 years later, now white folks are in the same boat or a similar boat, being racked by a drug addiction problem, wondering where the rehab facilities are. We don't have any, precious. You know why? Because we spent all the money locking those black folk away, and y'all didn't care. I'm not saying y'all, but the people that are complaining and whining about it are oftentimes the very same people that voted for the very same politicians that didn't want to solve the problem, because that was those people, right? It's those people over there on that side. So we don't have to care. Now my little cousin is addicted to Oxy. What are we going to do for him? Well, I don't know. Maybe we should have realized that our fates were linked from the very beginning, as if we had done that, right? In other words, if we cared about black life, if black lives had mattered sufficiently 40 years ago, 50 years ago, when the first opioid crisis hit, the heroin crisis of the early 70s, if black lives had mattered enough to us then a lot of those white lives that had been sacrificed since would have been saved. Right? Same thing was true with COVID. Right? COVID hits, and in the first couple of months, it was headquartered and centered where? In large urban areas on the East Coast and on the West Coast, and rural and semi-rural folk and small town folks. Oh, it's not about us. Right? Then the news came out that disproportionately it was black folks that were doing the dying. The first 2 months, only 28% of the dead were white. A lot of folks got comfortable. Right? A lot of folks got comfortable. I'm not wearing a mask. I'm not getting a vaccine. That's Satan's DNA they're trying to put in. What the hell ever. Like, sorry if I'm mocking something you find true and hold dear to your heart, but some things are mocking worthy. Like, you know, they're putting the DNA of the devil in. Okay, whatever. Right? I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to stand 6 feet away from you at Trader Joe's. What are you, the Gestapo? What's next? Concentration camp? Social distancing my ass, right? And all of a sudden, these same folks who decided that this wasn't a problem for them, because it's those people over there, and it's not that they wanted them to die, but they just were like, out of sight, out of mind, not my problem. But by the end of 2020, what did the numbers show us? By the end of 2020, when some folk took their foot off the brake because they didn't think it was about them, and those people were disproportionately white folk and working class folk in rural and semi-rural areas who had decided, perhaps for political reasons or whatever other reason, that they didn't need to take the same kind of precautions, by the end of 2020, 55% of the dead each month were white. Now, 63.5% of the people who have died of COVID have been non-Hispanic white, as the Census Bureau calls us, right? 63.5% of the dead. In other words, because we took our foot off the brake, and in part we did that because we didn't think it was going to hit us, it came back and bit us on the ass. We are linked. Our fates are linked. If black life had mattered enough to the broader American society, we might have responded differently. This is why we can't allow pain over in this side of the body and act like it's not going to metastasize. It will metastasize. It will come back to haunt us all. This isn't about helping black and brown folk for some politically correct ideological motive. It's about saving ourselves. By the year 2045, you've heard the numbers, and I know some people get all twisted about this. I can't even empathize, right? By 2045, this country is no longer going to be quote-unquote majority white, whatever that means. I know some folks are freaking out about it. Doesn't matter. I don't care. Nothing's going to change it, y'all. Nothing is going to change it. I know there's some white folks in Arizona horribly upset about it, but the average age of those white folks is about 111, so tick-tock. You know, probably not going to matter a whole lot more. I'm not saying I want them to die, I'm just saying I understand the cycle of life. That's all I'm saying. Right? I understand the way it works, you know? I saw Lion King. I understand that. There are folks who are mightily upset about the change in this country, but here's the deal. Do y'all understand the median age of white people in this country is 45 years old? For white women, it's 46. That's just a fact. That's the median. You know what the mode is, right? The mode is the one that, if you line up all the numbers, it's the one that appears the most often, right? You know what the most typical age for white people in this country is? 58. 58 is the most typical age, and 45 is the median age. Guess what? People that are in their 40s and 50s don't do a lot of the labor that has to get done and a lot of the jobs that have to get done to maintain an advanced industrial economy, or even an agricultural economy for that matter, right? And people in their 40s and 50s not having a lot of babies. That's why the fertility rates have declined, because the dominant majority population has been aging so much, which means that if we do not have welcoming immigration policy for a lot of folk who are not in fact white folk, and if we don't encourage educational access and opportunity for the increasing American majority, this country isn't going to survive, right? The modal age for white folks, 58. You know what the mode for Latinos is? 11. 11 is the mode for those that the census calls Hispanic. That is the most common age. So in other words, the future is brown whether folk like it or not. I understand white nationalists don't like it, but do you like having a job at all? Do you like having out? Do you like an economy that functions? Because we're either going to be a multiracial democracy or we're not going to exist anymore. It is that simple. It is an existential crisis. So the idea of expanding opportunity and expanding the circle of inclusion to make sure that everybody is a part of it is not some charitable thing. This is not charity. It's not what we do to save those poor benighted souls over there on that side of town. It's what we do as a matter of self-help. It is a way that we maintain the society that we say that we care about, and the way that we can, again, as Baldwin said, achieve our country. For the first time in the history of this country, we have the opportunity to make America great. Not again, but for the very first time and for everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. Take a couple since we started a few minutes late. We can do 5 or 6 minutes of them if you have any. Or we can stare at each other. Yes.
This isn't a question. I was born here, and I kind of came here to learn about my own racism.
Yeah.
But I have 12th grade education.
Yeah.
I just want to say thank you very much for allowing me.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Any others? You don't have to praise me necessarily. You don't have to say nice things about me. Don't say ugly things, but you don't have to be as nice as that. You can. You can clap.
Has your talk changed as physics have changed? A couple decades.
Yeah. My talks have changed a lot in the sense that when I go back and some things change. I mean, I wish that more had changed. Sadly, the situation hasn't really changed that much, and so a lot of the same kinds of conversations that I was having 30 years ago, still having. And that's both depressing, but also, I guess indicative of just the reality that there are people that have been at it a lot longer than me that would say the same thing. They'd say we've been having the same conversations for 50 years or 60 years. If people live long enough, probably having some of these conversations 100 or 200 years ago, right? So, but where it has changed is this. So I come out of an activist background. I was a community organizer and an activist in New Orleans right out of college. And as an activist, I had a very different attitude about my presentations. And my attitude was, I'm just going to tell you what the hell I want to tell you, and I really don't care if you like it or not. Right? Now, there's still part of that in the style of my delivery, but I also try to make sure that people laugh a little bit and can relax and be entertained. And that is a very deliberate pedagogical trick. I'm not saying that I'm manipulating you. I'm just saying, well, all education is manipulation, first of all. Like, it is. Whether you're a parent educating your child, whether you're a teacher, it's all manipulation, either loving or not so loving. And what I've learned in the 30 years is that I can't go at this the way that I did when I started. When I look at old speeches, old tapes, when I pop in like an old VHS tape and watch, it's horrifying to me. Horrifying. I thought I was pretty good at my job when I was 28. I was not good at my job when I was 28 or 26 or whatever I was when I started on the lecture series. Because I would just get up there and I would be like, and another thing, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and another thing. And I would spend the entire hour proving that systemic racism was a thing. And man, I could prove it. One of the reasons I didn't bother today is I learned not that I can't do it anymore, but it's not the point, right? If you're really going to come and deny the basic reality that black and brown folks live, then I'm not going to be able to change your mind in an hour. I have to create a different space and set a different table. And what I've learned is not to think of it as, I used to come at it like a high school debater, which is what I was, and a college debater, which is what I was, right? I came at it with that mentality, like I'm going to win this argument. But then I realized, wait, this isn't about winning arguments. Right? It's about changing culture. It's about changing the society. It's about reaching people where they are. And where they are is not, we didn't evolve to respond to statistics and spreadsheets. We evolved to respond to storytelling. We respond to human interaction. We respond to emotion, right? And so if I can put people at ease with a little humor, I never used to use humor at all, ever, at all. And in part that was because I thought, these are very serious subjects. People are dying. We can't be funny. There's no laughter until the revolution. Like it was basically, that was sort of the mentality. We will laugh when the revolution happens, then we will dance. Not until. And what I learned was if you don't laugh and if you take yourself too seriously, people will. I remember I watched those tapes of the old speeches and people are like, "Yay, that's the clapping." It's like, wow, that hurt a lot. Like, I'm so not glad that I came to this talk. And then the ones who would clap really and love it, they were dangerous people. They were just like, yeah, he's making them all feel like shit. I love that. And then you just get to the point where like, making you feel that. What's that? That's about me. That's about me gratifying my ego needs, not about making a difference as an educator. So I went from being an activist to being an educator. There's a fundamental difference. Both are valuable skills. But in this context, trying to teach people, it's about being an educator, and that means meeting you where you are and trying to help you get to a different place. It might make you a little uncomfortable, but at least with a little bit of humor and a little bit of human regard and non-judgmentalism, that takes a little bit of that sting off and allows you to hear what it is that's being said. So that has changed. One more if there's right now.
You discussed the privilege of being at least that hit me right here, and I just, as you walk out of here, we want to remove maybe some of that obliviousness that we're looking at practical.
I think the best place to start, I remember for me, it again dates me a little bit, but back in the early 90s when I started doing this work, I remember having conversations with some of my mentors, and I remember they asked me, why do you do this? Why do you care about this? You don't have to. As a young, middle-class, college-educated, white male, straight, all these things that, I am Jewish from Nashville, so y'all can do the math on that one. Not all of my identities are dominant. There is that one little thing, and I'm 5'8" in the tall man's world, so it's fine. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. I'm 55. I'm good. I don't care. If I was 25, I'd feel some kind of way. I'm 55. I don't even know where I was going with that. But I remember talking to my mentors and saying, and they would ask me that question, and I would say, I'd always come up with some ridiculous answer that I thought was appropriately political. So I would do what all the nice white liberals do, which was we'd come up with a Dr. King quote, because why not? And I would come up with one like, well, an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And my mentors were like, yeah, that's a good one. That one's taken. So maybe you come up with another one. And they said, what you need to do is take inventory of your life, right? Just a simple, and this was like pen and paper inventory. I didn't have a computer. I think I had one of those old school word processors. You could type like one sentence at a time, and then you hit enter, and it would all show up on the page, and you thought it was magic. But I just took out a legal pad and a pen, and I started taking inventory. I started going back over my life a little bit and exploring all the places that race had intervened in some way, mine or the race of others, had somehow intervened in my life. Things that I had been, frankly, not oblivious to, but that I hadn't thought about in a long time. And as I went down the list, and I went in backward order, reverse chronology, so the newest memories were the easiest ones to recall. And then I would just go back and back and back, and pretty soon I got all the way back to early childhood, remembering some of the very first memories that I had actually involved race. Some of them I had not thought about in a very, very long time, because I'd had the luxury of being oblivious. And as I went back and I looked at it, it opened up so many doors for me, because I saw times that I had witnessed racism against my black and brown friends, and I know like all white people say we have black friends, we're usually lying. I had like nothing but for a while. I went to a black preschool, I went to Tennessee State University in Nashville for preschool, historically black college, early childhood ed program. Almost all of my early friends were black friends, and I saw them treated differently, but I hadn't thought about that in a while, right? And now I'm realizing like, oh, that's why I care about this. And that opened up a whole range of possibilities, because I saw myself in those moments. Sometimes I didn't always stand up for them the way I should. Sometimes I failed my friends. Other times I did exactly what I should have done, and I could be proud of that. But either way, whether I responded appropriately or didn't respond appropriately enough, just having that memory, forcing those memories, was really, really helpful. And so what I encourage people to do, and not just with race, you can do it with race, you can do it with class, you can do it with gender, with sex, with sexuality, religion, all these different areas, is think about all the ways in which your identities, plural, have influenced your life. Some of those identities are going to have influenced your life in a positive and advantageous way. Some of them are going to have influenced your life in a negative and disadvantageous way. But you need to be clear on both sides of that equation, because if you want others to have compassion for the place that you got hurt, and we've all been hurt somewhere, not only do all of us have some kind of privilege, most of us have got some area where we've been targeted. Some area where we've been the target of someone else's, crappy behavior or attitude or meanness or whatever. But if we want compassion for that area, we got to give compassion. It's about reciprocity, right? So me growing up Jewish in Nashville, being told by teachers that I was going to hell. Public schools, y'all, just like, they just stick their hand in the door, like, you're going to hell. I know, you told me last time. Thank you for the refresher, right? Sending me to Young Life meetings. Young Life is an absolutely fabulous organization if you're a Christian youth. If you're a Jew, not so much, right? And so I had this, threatened to sue, because of course I did. And I walked out of the meeting, and the principal cornered me in the hall. Where you going? I said, I'm going to call my lawyer. He said, you're 11. You don't have a lawyer. I said, no, but I have the ACLU number in my pocket. I've had it since I was 5, which was true, by the way. He never made me go to another Young Life meeting. But my point is, if I wanted sympathy for that from my friends of color, let's say, who were Christians, who probably didn't think twice about Young Life, probably didn't think twice about going to a Christian youth meeting, because they all were Christians, they all went to church. If I wanted sympathy from them, I had to extend sympathy about what they were facing as black kids in that school, being trapped into the lower track, being disciplined more harshly, even though we all acted fools, because we're all 11-year-olds or whatever, and 11-year-olds act like fools, right? So but you can't do any of what I just said if you don't take inventory. So my recommendation is everyone just do like a critical autobiography of your life. You don't have to publish it. Just write it up. Just it could be notes, it could be written text, it could be poems, it could be songs, whatever modality you prefer, but just something that gets you in touch with the ways in which identity is shaped. Because once you understand that, once I had that list in front of me, and I could no longer be as oblivious, it meant that I understood instead of trying to figure out what does it mean to be black, what does it mean to be brown, what does it mean to be a person of color, I'm never going to fully understand that. They tried to get us to understand it by reading certain books, and so I remember being asked to read, Black Like Me, which ironically is written by a white dude who wasn't black at all, just took meds during the summer of '59 and went to the Jim Crow South to learn what it was to be black. And white folks loved that book. Apparently we couldn't listen to real black people, but we listened to the white guy who took drugs for 3 months and sat under sun lamps. And oh my God, it's hard to be black. And black writers were like, yeah, we've been telling you that. Right? But whatever, it worked, and I remember people reading it. I remember reading it in school thinking, it's a powerful story. But much more powerful is if I could get in touch with what does it mean not to be black, what does it mean to be white, right? Not what does it mean to just be Jewish in my case, but what does it mean for my kids who are not raised Jewish to be Gentile in a predominantly Gentile world, or Gentile country? What does it mean to be not poor, but what does it mean to be upper middle class? I certainly didn't start out that way, but I've done okay for myself, so now I have a whole different class positionality. I got to think about that. I know what it was to not have money. And now I know what it is to be comfortable, and I gotta be critical about what that means. I gotta understand what that means and how I can ultimately take advantage of that sometimes, not meaning to, but inadvertently, right? The kind of assumptions that I make as someone who has a college degree, has got a little money in the bank, just a little, but got a little bit of money in the bank, have some assets, right? What does that mean? What does it mean to be not LGBTQ? What does it mean to be straight and cisgendered in a world that those things are still too often taken for granted? What does it mean not to be disabled but able-bodied in a world constructed by and for people who are by and large able-bodied? Those are important questions. So that's the way that I think we can all take some ownership over this and take responsibility for this in our own lives. We can all do that. And that's not about having to share the same politics. We don't have to agree on politics. We don't have to vote for the same candidates. We don't have to think the same about this issue and that issue. But we can all engage in that exercise, and just the humility of doing it. Right? It's a humbling thing when you start to realize, like, man, I'm not completely in control of my life experiences. We like to think that we are. We like to think we're the captains of our ship, rugged individualism, we can do anything we want. But here's the thing, we are being moved around the chessboard by forces sometimes that are not within our control. And that's scary, but once you understand it, then you can take some more control over it. Once you understand what the dynamics are, then you can make the attempt to have more control over them than they have over you. But if you don't do that, you'll never get control of it, and you'll never know that you're being manipulated by those forces. Thank you all so much. I appreciate it.
Hey, thank you.